I haven't made a video in quite a while, and I needed a little project to push back an inevitable rewatch of Lord of the Rings. So, what I wanted to do today is go through some advice and recommendations for anyone looking to take in the iconic view of Western Brook Pond in Gros Morne National Park, Newfoundland. So, let's go to my office and take a look. I'll try to make this video short and sweet because it's for a pretty niche demographic, but I'm hoping anyone searching for it will still find it useful. I'll go over the most common ways to get to the park, as well as the most accessible and popular options to complete the trail itself. Okay, so how to get to Gros Morne. I imagine most people looking at this will probably be from Canada, but the international options will lead to the same results anyways, so I'm not going to overthink that. I will, however, assume you're not already in Newfoundland. On that note, I should probably also mention that I'm never sure which syllable to emphasize when saying Newfoundland, so I'm probably going to get that creatively wrong. So, option number one, fly into Deer Lake. Option number two, fly into Halifax. Historically, the Halifax option was notably cheaper for airfare and car rental, but as of 2023, the differences do not appear to be as notable. That's an easy thing to check for your personal circumstances and schedule. Might vary. As a result, we'll look more at the additional aspects considered for the Halifax option. There's the monetary cost side and the time cost side, and those can add up pretty quickly. You can expect an extra tank of gas for the drive between Halifax and North Sydney, and then the cost of the ferry between North Sydney and Port aux Basques. This is $150 each way when you have a car. And then there's about another tank of gas for the drive between Port aux Basques and Deer Lake. Once those are taken into account, you have more of an apples to apples comparison. As you can imagine, all those extras make it much more appealing to fly directly to Deer Lake, especially if the purpose of your journey is to spend time around Gros Morne. Although, if you simply wanted to visit me in Halifax, that's an okay choice too. Now that we've established you're in the national park, let's talk about the trail options. The first one we'll look at here will probably be the most popular. It's a guided day hike from the company Bond Tours. To the best of my knowledge, they're the only operator that's allowed to have boat access on Western Brook Pond, so they'll be featured pretty heavily in this guide. To go over the pros, it has a flat rate price of $325. So you might think that is a bit steep and could even be considered a con, but when you consider the fact you don't have to buy any extra equipment, camping gear and such, it can be comparatively cheap. Also, you have the enhanced safety of being with a trained guide and only being out during daylight. The downside of this option is that it requires at least 4 participants. That means it could be canceled or postponed with little or no notice. Being in a mixed group and on a tight schedule means you'll also have limited control over your experience at the top, where you may only have an hour or so at the plateau. After that point, you'll need to start thinking about transitioning back down the trail in order to beat sunset, so something to consider. The other guided tour option is the overnight variant. This one costs $450, and I don't really consider that a pro or a con because, as far as I'm aware, it does not include gear, so the cost will only scale up from there. However, as a pro, it only requires a one night commitment. None of the other trail options, in my opinion, could be completed in a single night, or at least not in an enjoyable way. So, this is a definite pro for this option, where if time is of the utmost importance to you, this is the one that'll open that door. As well, similar with the previous, this one does provide you a trained guide, so you have enhanced safety compared to if you were doing it on your own. To look at the negatives, this option as well requires at least 4 participants, otherwise, it may be canceled or postponed with very little notice. The other thing that sort of bridges the gap between pro and con is that this is a highly customized service. So, depending on the other party members and the guide, you could end up with quite a different experience. So, could be a pro, could be a con. All right, now we'll go through some of these self guided options. So, the first one we want to look at is the long range traverse. This one has a price of $107.50 plus a $40 fee to take the boat to the trailhead. A pro of this option is that comparatively, there is very little risk of involuntary cancellation because the only third party you're relying on are the ferry tours to get you to the trailhead. As well, it almost doesn't need to be said, but you're in control of your own destiny here. You can spend as much or as little time in whatever areas you pass through. As well, on this trail, there is an alternate route that includes the Gros Morne mountain peak, which is stunning. In terms of the cons of this trail, You definitely require navigation and backcountry experience, otherwise, you're putting your health and safety at risk. As well, it does require a taxi or a car share in order to get to the trailhead. As you can see on the map, you start at a different location than you end. And last but not least, this does require participation in a mandatory orientation session. These only occur once per day at 2:30 p.m. So you need to add an additional day before you plan to start your trip in order to make sure you meet this orientation requirement. The last option we'll look through here is another self-guided overnight hike. This one is the Northern Traverse. So this one has the lowest upfront cost, where it costs $88.50 for the permit and then $40 to take the ferry to the trailhead. This route requires even less reliance on third parties because the route you take takes you right back to the parking lot. So you don't need to worry about taxis or car shares or any of that nonsense. And similar with the long range traverse, you are in charge of your own destiny here, so you can spend as much or as little time in any area that you want. As well, there's a couple alternate routes here that take you to very beautiful views at the top of the plateau that overlook the pond. So, something to look forward to. The Northern Traverse requires navigation and backcountry experience to an even larger extent than the long range traverse. The reason for this is that the tundra-like environment makes it virtually impossible to use landmarks to aid in navigation, and there are few points of high ground to establish a vantage point. Beyond that, you have to deal with the painful and disorienting forests of Tuckamore. If you're not careful, they can easily cause injury or significant gear damage. Additionally, there's a long stretch of trail with no water access. Not a huge con, but it's something you want to be cognizant of when planning your water carries. Same as with the LRT, this trail requires participation in an orientation session, meaning you need to arrive one day before you intend to leave on the trail. The only difference for this one is the trail staff will really try to discourage you from taking it, unless you're 100% confident in your abilities. Last but not least, the tundra environment can get a bit stale if you're walking through it for 2 days straight. It's not for everyone. In summary, what's my personal recommendation after having done it a few times myself? I would highly encourage flying directly to Deer Lake. The drive and ferry from Halifax are rather expensive, and the sights you see on the way are likely to be underwhelming unless you have a few days of dedicated downtime to spend in Halifax to compensate for that. From there, I'd say it's definitely worth renting a car unless your only purpose of the trip is this backcountry trail. In that case, you might be able to scrape by with a few cab rides. Otherwise, the park is gigantic, and having a car makes it much easier to navigate and more worth your time. In terms of the trail options, if you have limited backcountry experience, I'd say your best bet is the guided day trip. If you have a group of 4 or more, the overnight trip might be a good option as well, but fewer than that, it's hard to recommend. My overall top recommendation, however, if you are comfortable having a few days of wet feet and doing GPS navigation, I think the long range traverse is a good entry point for the moderately serious hiker. This one is still beautiful in terms of views, but much easier on the body and mind compared to the northern traverse. If you have any questions on these topics, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I hope you have a great time out there.